The dead shall not be mourned or remembered, for death is the enemy and will only drive the seraph away. To keep death in our hearts is to delay her return in the promised dawn. The Book of the Blood. Father's officers shuffled around the map on the council room table, pointing out routes and offering suggestions, each one more certain than the last about the location of the missing airship. Half a dozen voices, all arguing over whose unsuitable excuse would be brought to the king. Adrian stood by the window with his back to them, gaze set on the palace grounds, mind set on his brother. Jovu would have had theories of his own, no doubt, and the officers would likely have followed them. It should have been him standing in the room instead of Adrian. Father would certainly say so, but everything had changed when Jovu died, and Adrian was all that was left. None mentioned the dead prince, of course. They'd never risk falling out of the church's grace by speaking of the dead, but that didn't stop the questions in Adrian's mind. Why had Father sent Jovu into the clanlands in the first place? Why had the pontiff not preserved Jovu's body to be brought back in the promised dawn? They'd followed the Church of the Seraph, lived for hundreds of years off what the pontiff called her blessings, but how much was each year worth if Jovu's name couldn't ever be spoken again? Adrian let out a long breath and turned to look at the officers, still arguing around the map of the domain. He'd never even believed in the blessings, and he was sure his years came from the power of his family's blood, not some misguided notion that the seraph found them worthy. Yet Father seemed to have a different opinion, and it was strong enough to sacrifice the memory of his eldest son. He left the men to argue in the room and paced down the corridor until he reached the open doors of the reflection hall. Mira sat on a low stone bench in the centre of the rectangular chamber, head bowed, hands on her lap, while priests tended to scriptures and images of griffin riders carved into the walls. They brushed off motes of dust that drifted in the rays of sunlight streaming in from the openings above. Adrian watched her for a while, silent, holding back any expression that could alert the priests to his true feelings about Jovu. One of the clergymen lingered on him, his eyes inviting Adrian into the chamber, perhaps, but he managed nothing other than a frown in return. His own eyes were still dry from the lack of sleep, his throat still tight from strangling down the tears he could not show. He shifted his feet, and the clinking of his sword caught Mira's attention. She rose and walked towards him with a solemn aspect of her own, while Adrian forced a steady gaze into his eyes and a weak smile onto his lips, his best attempt at masking the ache tearing at his chest. She stepped into the corridor and tilted her head while pulling him away from the sight of the priests. "You don't have to put on that face with me," she said in a gentle voice. Adrian's mouth twisted and he closed his eyes, trying to keep back the pain that was seeping through. She stepped up and kissed him lightly on the lips. "I'll always be here for you," she said, then gave him a smile, much warmer than his own. It was veiled by the waves of her auburn hair, but touched her leaf-green eyes and was as soft as the lines of her face. He held her gaze for a while, hoping he could forget all of it, wake up from whatever madness had fallen upon them. "He shouldn't have gone," Adrian said. "You shouldn't dwell on this, Adrian. We should look ahead." "He attacked the clans, Mira." Adrian started moving down the hallway, struggling to keep his voice down, and she followed. Jovu had been the leader of the Athonian armies for over 100 years. He never attacked the clans. Not even the pontiff would have ordered it. "Wasn't he expanding the domain?" Adrian shook his head. "No, I heard things after he left. One of Father's generals grumbling to his captains about being left behind. Jovu was looking for something my father trusted no one else to look for." "In the clanlands? What could have been so important outside of the domain?" "I'm not sure, but he was willing to sacrifice Jovu for whatever it was he was after."